So we're delighted to have Peri Stone-Palmquist here. I've known Peri for many years. We've worked together on the School Justice Committee for about 4 years now. And Peri was the inspiration for changing the state law so that instead of suspending people more quickly, they went through a procedure that they worked on to contact the family and contact the kids. And really, this was about attendance and really make sure that the kids weren't immediately kicked out of school. So thanks to Peri, the state law has changed.
Just me. I did it all by myself.
You didn't do it all by yourself, but she was the main inspiration. And she's been working for the Student Advocacy Center for 7 years, and I asked her how old it was, and we counted up and we said it's 44 years old. I think you're only the second director, too.
I'm the third director, although a lot of people think I'm just the second director, but there was somebody between Ruth and I, yes.
Okay, very good. So we're delighted to have you here today.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to answer the question, too.
All right.
I think what I always share is that my staff find it ironic that I never got in trouble really in school, other than for, talking and got my name on the board. But I remember being anxious a lot in school and nervous that I was going to get in trouble or I didn't know the right answer. So although I had lots of positives, for some reason today, that's what is sticking out in my head. So, well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I think we met each other more than 5 years ago at School Justice Partnership. Yeah.
Yeah. We were working on Roberto Clemente together, I think.
Maybe, yeah, that sounds right. Mm-hmm. So Student Advocacy Center has a long-time partnership with DRC, and just have great respect for all of you who volunteer your time and do this work. So it's an honor to be here and talk with you. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Student Advocacy Center in a minute, but I like to start with a question. We don't have to go around the circle, but I'm wondering what you think might be the difference between advocacy and mediation. So I'm coming to you as an advocate. I'm not a mediator. So strange that I'm coming to train mediators, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but what do you think is the difference? Yeah.
You're not a neutral party. You're actually advocating for their interests. So
yes.
Their best interests in mind, whoever you're representing.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I was a newspaper reporter for 5 years. I had to be neutral when I was a newspaper reporter. And I was really done with that. I didn't want to be neutral anymore. It's important, but not for me. What else might be the difference? Yeah.
You're rooting for the underdog.
Rooting for the underdog. I like that. That's what you were going to say?
No, I said not necessarily for the underdog, but...
No, but maybe underdog is not good. It's the weaker part, the less represented.
Less
part.
resourced, maybe. Less resourced.
part.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Anything else come to mind?
Helping people who don't have a voice.
Yes. Might have to pass it that way. So an intern worked on this for us, and then we kind of went back and forth with Belinda a little bit, because I feel like I was getting more and more questions as restorative was getting its due and getting paid more attention to. People would get confused because we will advocate for restorative practice. So, well, what's the difference between you and the DRC? I'm like, well, there's a lot of difference, but part of the journey for me to be able to explain that was to create this chart. And you guys already spoke to a lot of the things that are on here. So yeah, we're not neutral. Our logo actually has a megaphone in it, and so from the beginning, when our founder, who just turned 90, Ruth Zweifler, I know some of you know her, she was all about amplifying the voice, and that's a big deal for us. So we find often in school meetings or school situations that no one's even asked the kid what they want or are feeling or thinking, and so that's always where we start, and we're trying to amplify their voice. And I think that we definitely have an opinion going in to those meetings, and we're trying to advocate for what that family wants and needs. Whereas I think mediators are that important neutral voice, so to make sure everyone's being heard. They're both important. So this is what I want to emphasize. Step back for a second as we're talking through this. One's not better than the other, right? They're both super important. Maybe you guys do think mediation's better than advocacy. That's fine, but I don't think it's a competition. I think And I think my guess is that we all borrow from each other's toolkits as well. So the next one is really about seeking to change policies and practices and impacting systems. So one of our core values as an organization is not just to have these individual cases, but to take from those cases what we learn and try to affect change. So a little bit later today, I'm going to talk about the law that I single-handedly changed. Not at all. I'm not going to tell you the whole story of how that got changed, but Michigan had one of the harshest school discipline policies in the country, and so we've been advocating for many years before I started at Student Advocacy Center, but it really sort of amped up in the first 5 years of my tenure at SAC, and I think DRC and many other mediators were part of that as well. But I think it's built into what we're doing. We're trying to change policy and practice, and so for the counterpart, we said mediators are really to listen to disputing parties and to facilitate open and honest communication. So. Again, I just want to note that there's probably things, well, yeah, we do that, and our advocates will say, well, yeah, we do that, but so we're trying to create this, there's gray lines, I think, in between these. So I think someone said, maybe Tom, it was you, or someone said, seek to amplify the voice of the student, and we're trying to address power imbalances. So I'm going to talk about that in some of my stories today. Would you say that sometimes mediators do some of that, addressing power imbalances? Sure, I think so too. Yeah.
Just being heard, I think,
Yeah.
empowers them.
Absolutely, for sure. So yeah, I think we work with families to set and meet goals, and I think I've seen mediators do that as well, but I think when you're going into a mediation, they're trying to address a specific dispute and resolve that specific dispute. I'm not sure, again, if these are perfect either-ors, right? But this last one, I think, maybe is good. Aims to get an outcome that best meets the needs and wishes of the student or caregiver. So that I'm not a neutral third party. And to be honest, I am sometimes thinking about what also is good for the school. We're part of the community. We are advocating for multiple students in a school, so we can't just think about that one student. But that is what, as an advocate, we are supposed to be really thinking about. It's a little bit more complicated than that, right? But whereas mediators are aiming to get outcomes where parties are collaborating and compromising. But we do that too. So there really isn't any difference, right? No, I mean there is, but I think we borrow from each other's toolkits. Any other thoughts about maybe differences?
I think of an advocate that could be thought of as a defense attorney, as opposed with a client, which they don't ask whether they're guilty or not, but they're making the best effort to get them the best resolution or outcome of the issue.
Yes, I like that. And I like to say that we're like kind of advocates plus, because I think at Student Advocacy Center we're really working to help that student grow, and we actually use restorative tools to help do that, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And we're really there to support them over the long haul. So it's not just we're there to go to one meeting and then like peace out. We're really about building a relationship with our students and really helping resolve a lot of different issues for them. Yeah, but I appreciate that. Any other thoughts about advocacy versus mediation? Had you ever thought about that before? Is that a new pondering? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Student Advocacy Center. As Sally mentioned, we were started in 1975. We were started in Ann Arbor by members of the NAACP and different community members, city leaders who were really concerned about how students of color in particular were doing in Ann Arbor schools, how they were being treated, the lack of resources, just the attitude. And I wish I could say that things have dramatically changed, but I think we continue to have our work cut out for us as I talk to families of color, even in Ann Arbor schools. But that was where it started. Very quickly, Ruth Zweifler met Margaret Harner, who's a longtime community advocate in Ypsilanti schools, and before you know it, Ruth is driving all over the state, going to school discipline hearings, special education meetings, behavior meetings. So it kind of grew quickly. So today, we have offices in Ypsilanti. Downtown Ypsilanti is our headquarters. We have offices in Detroit and Ypsilanti, in Jackson, sorry, I already said Ypsilanti, Jackson. And we get hundreds of calls all over the state on our statewide helpline to help families right then whenever there's an educational crisis. We have sort of this continuum, yeah.
Question. You're always contacted by the family. Has schools ever,
Yeah.
teachers contacted you? Just
Yes. And I have superintendents who have me on their speed dial for advice every once in a while, so yeah. So we have sort of this continuum of services. We have the helpline, which is a quick, it may just be quick, they're calling, quick advice, their kid's going to be expelled tomorrow, what do they do? Or my kid was expelled yesterday, that's the email I got at, I think 3 a.m. today. My kid was expelled, how do I appeal that? So those sorts of quick, how do we help them? And we may do an intake and we may assign an advocate for them. So we have staff advocates, we have a multidisciplinary team of advocates, social workers, teachers, psychologists on our staff, and then we have sort of a core of trained volunteer advocates. University of Michigan is our big partner. It's not an official university thing on purpose. I say that as an alum, but it's students that go to University of Michigan. And then we have kind of little clusters of other volunteer advocates who are training to go to school discipline hearings. So that's a broader range. We just did a training in Flint so community members in Flint might be able to help at school discipline hearings. And then, so that's that. So advocates will work with cases, I would say, anywhere between 3 to 6 months. But the truth is sometimes it's longer than that. Sometimes if we got the case and you're expelled for 180 days, we're not going to be like, see you later. We're going to help them throughout that entire expulsion, do what they need to get reinstated back into school, to find some kind of alternative education. So we'll stick with them, right, for that time. And our advocates do all sorts of things. We're taking them to community mental health appointments. We're taking them to school meetings. We're training them in bus safety if they got in a fight on the bus and that's why they were expelled. So kind of our approach is sort of do what it takes to help students be successful in school. And we're monitoring really closely once they're back in school. What are their grades, attendance, and discipline looking like so we can kind of tweak plans. Then we have a program I'm really proud of that we started shortly after I started. It's an evidence-based mentoring program and it's in the schools. So this is our kids that, a few months isn't going to do it. They have a host of complex issues that they're facing. They have to have been suspended or expelled, failing several classes. So these are really the kids who need the most help. And they're going into our evidence-based mentoring program called Check and Connect. So we work with them for up to 2 years. I'm sorry, at least 2 years. Sometimes it's 4 years. Sometimes it's been more than that. And we're meeting with them every single week. So it's a staff member, sometimes a social worker. We've had a teacher be a mentor, but it's a paid staff member. These are the students, again, that are struggling the most. A volunteer probably wouldn't work just because of the complexity of the trauma, mental illness, what's going on at home and what's going on at school. So they have to sort of be attuned to all of those things. The schools do the referrals for those. The schools often do the referrals for our advocacy cases too. We're automatically referred to in Washtenaw County if you're facing a suspension or expulsion.
Do you have occasion to advocate for any of the students up at High Point?
It's not High Point anymore. It's called what? Prospect Park.
No, yeah, I'm sorry.
We do. Yeah, we haven't had as many cases recently, so I don't know what that means. Usually that means there's not as many problems. Yeah, but it's interesting because there's years we'll have peaks at different schools and there's a lot going on, and then a new principal will come and it'll be worse or it'll be better. So it really it just depends on what's going on. So
You might
yeah,
know from your referrals
have.
how the principal's doing.
Yeah.
The reason I ask is I know there are parents and other interested citizens who are involved in that school meeting some of the needs for advocacies for challenges that they see there.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Who are your funding, how do you get your funding and to whom are you responsible?
Yeah, I will get to that. Check and Connect, what's the next? Then we have a truancy program, if you want to call it that, in Jackson, where we're working in-home. We have a family advocate that's working with elementary age kiddos because they're missing a lot of school. So we were just talking about that, Tom. We go in and really try to figure out what it is that's a barrier for them and create a plan. We do parenting classes for them. And I'm forgetting one program. Youth Action is our youth leadership and youth organizing work where we're really helping our students have an opportunity and support to really try to change policies. So it's a little dormant right now because it's very challenging to keep doing that work because most of our students are frankly in crisis when we're working with them often. But those are the youth that came with me to Lansing to testify, so I really prefer to give them credit for the fact that the law changed because I think that's what really makes a difference is when we allow students to go to school board meetings and to go to places where they can make decisions. It's complicated and requires a lot of support, but we're really proud of the work that we've done. I see lots of hands. Can I answer the funding question first, and then can we?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So just to answer that question, so certainly rely a lot on donations. There wasn't hardly any when I started, and so that was really restricting what we were able to do. So that's an important part of course, any nonprofit because none of your grants cover everything. And then we have contracts with community mental health, Washtenaw County Trial Court, coordinated funders, lots of different family foundations, Michigan Medicine, Wayne County Child Care Fund, Jackson United Way. So there's like a lot of different ones. I hope that is helpful. Okay, other questions?
I just wondered what evidence-based mentoring meant.
Oh, yeah.
Evidence-based.
Yeah, I'm not a researcher, but it just means it's gone through like a lot of testing and academics made it and that they've shown over many years. So Check and Connect was developed out of University of Minnesota. I want to say in the late 70s, early 80s, and they developed it specifically with students with emotional disorders. It was like kind of their first cohort. And so they're continuing, like I'm about to send my new staff member there to get trained in Minneapolis. So.
It means it's like a proven
Mm-hmm.
platform. Okay. thank you.
Yeah. Just like, I think you'd say restorative practices are an evidence-based, yeah. It's been tested, it's been evaluated, yeah.
Let me also add that one of the donations that Peri started was a program called Telling Tales Out of School, which they do once a year. And they bring in kids to talk and tell tales about how the Student Advocacy Center helped them.
This
And
held
so
out at the Townsend.
any of you can
What'd you
come.
say?
It's held out at the Townsend Center, isn't it?
It was, last year we did it at Scarlett Middle School for the first time, and I think that is where we're gonna keep doing it, because it was kind of cool to be in a school actually and do it there, yeah. Yeah, it's really cool to hear these kids be willing to. We had a young lady who was in foster care and who's now in college, but she shared her journey and, just the bravery it takes to stand up in front of 150, 200 people and share your experiences. And so I love that fundraiser because it's also giving our students a chance to grow, and they really find it powerful for them to be able to share their story. And it's one thing to share their story with us or whatever we know it, but to have that many people witness it and go up to them afterwards, and it's a powerful night
So
for
if you
sure.
want to be on the list to be notified.
Oh
That's
yeah.
my next question.
Oh.
We know about
Yeah, we could do, if I was a better executive director, I would have brought a sign-up sheet, but we'll just make one.
Oh, I can,
We'll just make one.
all right.
Yeah.
And just email address?
Yeah, you can just put your name and your email address. That'd be great.
another quick question.
Yeah, of course.
I'm still reading from the 180 that you mentioned, that number of suspension.
180-day expulsions.
180
Yeah.
days.
Yeah.
I mean,
Does that really happen?
does it really happen? Is there a limit?
There's not a limit. So you can be expelled. You can have a permanent expulsion of 180 days. I think it's less since the new law changed. I think it's less. It is less, but it's about, I haven't seen the new numbers for last year, but it's about 6 students a day, every school day in Michigan is expelled. And then once you're expelled, you never have a right to be able to return. You have to be reinstated, which means you have to beg for your education and prove why you're worthy of an education. So that's what happens. There's not very many expulsions in Washtenaw County, thankfully. But I will say what we're seeing since the new laws have passed is that they're doing sneaky things like, I don't think this is a good fit for you, and why don't we assign you to this virtual school? So that's what we're seeing in Washtenaw County. And it's a tricky place to advocate. It's one thing if it's a very formal, I can go to this meeting and advocate for whatever, but I actually have to request hearings now, so that's kind of where we're at now.
Okay, and Telling Tales Out of School is in the spring, right?
Yep. I feel like I should know the exact date. I think it's going to be April 17th or something like that, yeah.
So are there specific
parameters for expulsion? They must go through certain things before they can expel a student?
We are going to get to that.
Okay.
We're going to get to that. I'm going to talk about the new law in a few minutes, but what I wanted to start with is just to share with you sort of our journey as an organization of how we've been starting to use restorative practices in our work. So we are not neutral third parties, but we see the value in the tools that you guys use every day, and so we've started to do that. So I think we have a long history of attending special education mediations, and I think it's been a while since I've personally been to one because I'm not allowed to take as many cases as I used to. My board got after me. But I think some of the ones that I'm thinking in my remembering, I think what was helpful in those, I think we made a good team and we felt like a team. Maybe the schools didn't want us to, but we felt like a team with the mediator. And so I think a lot of times it's situations where the parent really just hasn't felt heard in a really long time, or they get flustered really easily. They're feeling intimidated by the schools. And so one of the things I do, even in regular, in meetings where there's not a mediator, is like, we're going to take a break. The parent needs a minute to go out, and then like reminding them and focusing them on what their goals are that they've already told me. So kind of just to help, and mediators do that too, but then we're kind of tag teaming. So I think there's often situations that it's gotten so challenging with the parent and the school that even having a neutral third party, they're not feeling like, they're still feeling really tense, or like they're not able to articulate quite what they wanted. And so I think that partnership in certain situations has been really helping over the years. So that's kind of
maybe 4, 5, 6, 10 people from the school.
Exactly. So it's kind of helping maybe balance that a little bit so that they really can feel like they're heard, so they can be like, wait, sometimes you can feel like lost when the schools are talking, their attorney's talking. I mean, I feel like I can feel intimidated, when an attorney's like saying X, Y, or Z. And so I think that's been one of the ways, is just to support that. So we often advocate that mediation be used, and then be that support person for the family. So that's kind of, I think, how our foray into it. And I can't remember when we started doing this, but we started using restorative questions with our students, and it's been a really powerful tool. It's been a really powerful tool. So there were the 5 questions, right? What happened? Which you usually have to ask about 20 times to get to the full story. What happened before? What happened? So asking all those questions to really get our students to reflect on what happened truly, what started this whole thing, and who was harmed. And that is really hard. We work with a lot of boys, and I'm a mother of a son, so I love my boys, but and they haven't had a lot of conversations like these before. They've been yelled at, they've been shamed, they've been told how terrible they are, but they haven't had an opportunity to really reflect and think. And a lot of times, the parents will want to, I got some stuff. I'm like, I promise I'm going to give you a chance to speak, but we really need to talk to your son or daughter or whatever about what happened first. So let's do that. And so we meet for several hours. This is before a disciplinary hearing in particular. And getting them to think really broadly about who was harmed, right? So like, they can usually, kids at that age developmentally are often like, well, I'm harmed, I'm out of school. They always get that one. And I'm like, let's keep thinking who else might be harmed. And then sometimes they will say their parent. If they got in a fight with someone, like, that's pretty obvious, but then we try to help them think more broadly. Like, what would it be like for a teacher to be working in a school where people are getting in fights all the time? And that one usually takes a few minutes of like them really thinking about, well, that wouldn't bother me. I'm like, oh, really? It wouldn't? So let's talk about that. Thinking about the principal, thinking about other administrators, but then thinking about how might they repair the harm. And so that's the conversation that is deeper in what we're going to bring to the hearing. Like, what could you do instead of just kicking this kid out for 180 days, which does nothing to teach them about how to repair any harm. It does nothing to hold them responsible or have other people feel heard. And so those questions have been really meaningful, and I think have helped our students advocate for themselves in a very different and powerful way when we go to hearings. So of course I'm going to say something, but I always say that's not what's important. and even me being at the hearing is not what's most important. What actually is most important is that meeting where I'm asking these restorative questions, in my opinion, when we're talking about school discipline. So they are really ready to advocate for themselves. And I'm there, like I have their statement just in case. I often have to read the parent statement because they'll start crying because it's emotional to have your kid about to face 180-day expulsion. Like that's an emotional thing for most families. But those questions have been really powerful. So then we,
80 days sometimes are mandatory. Are they still mandatory?
they're not mandatory. They're not mandatory, yeah.
That's been changed.
Well, it's interesting because it still sort of reads as if it's mandatory in the law, but no, it's not. But we'll get to that, I promise, yes.
How many school days are in a year?
About 180.
So it's a
Yeah,
year.
right. It's a school year, but and there's not as many of those, like I said. But most kids don't don't act out the first day of school. They wait till about after count day, so that will start happening any day now. So then what ends up happening is they kind of, especially for high schoolers, they'll miss that this semester, the next semester, and then the next semester, if that's what ends up happening. Yeah. So we started advocating that schools use restorative practices in schools. Not just us using it as a practice, but just like really trying to get schools to do it. And so I think back, those of you who've been around for a while, when IPSI and Willow Run decided to merge, there was a committee that was working on climate. I think Belinda was involved in some of those. I don't know, it was a lot of evening meetings. It was super fun. And so many of us advocated that happened, that they proactively, before state law changed and it's required, which we'll get into, like that they start being really committed to training their staff to try to really resolve issues like that. So I can't remember when that was. Does anyone remember when those two districts merged? No, you've been around too long. What's that?
5 years.
5 years ago?
My guess is 5.
That seems right. 5 years, wow. So then we started advocating in more specific situations. So one, and both of these I'm pretty sure involved a DRC. So my success stories involve mediators that are trained, and I'm going to share later some ones that aren't as great and what I think the difference between those are. But I remember that there's a district in our county that shall remain nameless that remains pretty harsh still. It's gotten better, I'd say, in the last year, but literally in one school district you would get expelled for 180 days for a fight, and you could cross the street and go to another school district and you might get 10 days or something, right? So it's just stark. It's stark how school districts will handle these things. And I can't remember exactly what the scenario was, but it had either been a fight maybe in front of a teacher or somehow maybe a teacher. I think there was a fight in a classroom, that's what it was. And I think the teacher might have gotten sort of tried to block it and maybe had gotten elbowed or something like that, right? And so it was time for the student to come back. They applied for reinstatement, and I said, there's still some hard feelings probably. Like, what if we sat down and had a circle with that teacher so that they could actually, so this seemed like this was like blowing their minds, like they never thought about this particular school district, and I think Belinda was there. But anyway, DRC sent a couple mediators, and that was probably a good idea. But I just remember that was one of the first times I'd seen a circle in that way, and I just remember afterwards the teacher saying, like, we never get a chance to have any voice in what happens. They're seeing these things happen in their school. They are harmed, and they're never given a chance to restore the student. It's just like, all right, well, they're back in your classroom, and I think that's really damaging. So I don't think that happens enough, but it was enough for me to be like, we do need to be advocating for this. This is really important work, and the teachers found it really empowering. And I come from a family of teachers, so that's important to me. I think sometimes people feel like we're so laser focused on the students that we forget about the teachers, but we don't. It's just we're not the advocate for the teacher, we're the advocate for the student. So another story I want to tell you, and actually she tells her own story at one of our storytelling events many years ago, and it's up on our website if you want to hear it in her own words, but it was another really beautiful collaboration with DRC. She's an adult now. She's working on being a teacher or an accountant. She's so great. I just saw her the other day. But at the time that I started working with her, she was around 15 years old. She was very popular, very well liked, very outgoing. She came from a really big family, a two-parent family, but just a really large family. So she kind of got lost in the shuffle. Like maybe there were 6 or 7 kids, and pretty low income. So she would babysit a lot, helped out around the house. She got into fights, as some of us teenage girls do, with her dad. I more did it with my mom, but and so when that happened, she would go stay with friends. You know, she wouldn't stay at home. So technically, she was kind of living in some homeless situations at different times. And she was losing her temper a lot at school, not getting into physical things at all, but just she would be mouthy, be in places she wasn't supposed to. Some of us talk about using your powers for good. She wasn't using her powers for good yet. She was kind of getting in trouble, but a very charismatic student. And one day, her brother got into a verbal altercation. So the reason I gave you all that history is so you understand how important family was to her and is to her. And so there kind of became a shouting match in the hallway.
Between the two of them?
Between her brother and another student.
Okay.
And so she interjected herself and was trying to break it up. And eventually it wore down, and the teacher broke it up. The security officer was there, and the teacher says, just get out of here. Go to the office. Okay, so she's walking towards the office, and I guess the security officer didn't know that she had been directed to do so. So he comes up from behind her and maces her.
Oh my gosh.
And so she falls to the ground. Right, her eyes are. So she gets led eventually to wash her eyes out. This is in Washtenaw County that this happened. And so she was ultimately arrested. That could be considered like assaulting an officer, right? Because she, I don't know exactly what happened, but maybe it kind of hit him. So this is a situation we find a lot of our students of color in. It's like a misunderstanding, frankly, or you're having someone come up from behind. They're set up, in my opinion. So she ended up actually spending several days at the Juvenile Youth Center, which is where I'm headed after this meeting to visit a student. And because of that tension that she had with her dad, they did not come to get her right away. So if my son was at the Juvenile Youth Center, you better believe I would be there immediately to pick him up, but that's not what happened for this young person. And then to top that all off, she was recommended for expulsion, 180-day expulsion. So at that time, there was a DRC mediator in the school, and really an open principal. So we just sat down and we had a conversation. We're like, this is what happened. Let her tell her side of the story. And so I wouldn't say it was a hard sell necessarily, but what was beautiful about what happened is she found ways to become a leader, really. And so DRC did, in-school mediation, a variety of things, and she really, I think, became an advocate in the school for mediation. But then she was also, she got into our mentoring program so that we could really help her with some of those anger issues she was having and really be on her about her grades, and someone checking in with her every week. And then at that time, our youth action group was meeting at the school, so she became one of the leaders of that. So she designed this wonderful game she called it the Game of Life, where we did, and it was in the Lansing, the lawn of the Capitol. This was her whole idea. So it was to get legislators to come into the circle and experience the journey of being expelled. So we had different stations. So you could end up at a Restorative Circle station, or you could end up getting expelled, and then you have to go to the fake jail cell, which we had Jeff Irwin sit in for a picture, who's now our senator, one of my good friends. And so, so people could kind of experience what that felt like, all the different possibilities in that circle was her idea. So, and she testified, so she got all these leadership opportunities. So it was just this beautiful, but I think it was both of us working together. She was being shown a different way to resolve conflict, and then was able to advocate and was given sort of that support. Because frankly, the students that we work with, behaviors communication, and there's a lot going on in their lives, and they need multiple adults modeling, caring, taking the time to slow down and say, I'm not just going to kick you out because you did something that didn't all of this happen? Kids got in fights when I was a kid. It's been happening forever, right? And that was not even a physical fight, it was a verbal fight. Yeah, it can be really powerful, I think. Some people will say, well, there's too many nonprofits in Ann Arbor, and that's a whole other story. Maybe that's true. I don't know if that is true. All I can tell you is that the kids I see, especially in Ypsilanti, they're not connected to all of these nonprofits. They're lost, and they're not going to go drive to an appointment. They aren't engaged. That's the students that we are working with. And so I think it's nice when we can have partners that can really go above and beyond for these kids. So that's just one example, but one of my more powerful ones and a kiddo that I really love. So shortly after that, she helped us advocate is when the law changed. And so I just want to take a minute, pause, and tell you a little bit, not ad nauseum, but some of the things I thought you would be most interested in about what happened with the laws. Oh, wait. Let's go like this. So, like I said, Michigan had some of the harshest school discipline laws in the country. Why is that? We mandated expulsion for more reasons than other states, and then we allowed it for more reasons. And we had this 180-day permanent expulsion where you'd have to beg to get back in. So some of that is still there.
180-day permanent?
They call it permanent, but you can apply after so many days to come in. But I hate that it says it in the law. I hate that it says permanent. But I hated a lot of things about the law, so whatever. I'm obviously coming at it at a very different perspective. So I think that school justice partnership that Sally mentioned, that DRC was a big part of, I think is really what turned the tides, because we'd certainly been yelling into the darkness for many years about these laws, and they the zero tolerance laws sort of came out of research that talked about super predators, which was a way to really, coded language about students of color in particular, and to create fear, a lot about the war on drugs, all this stuff, right? It was a reaction to stuff that happened at Columbine. It was this veiled thing, we're going to call it school discipline, but I think we can talk about how there's those threads of racism and just other stuff that happened in those laws. But the beautiful thing about school justice partnership was that it brought the judges together and law enforcement, because they see the negative effects, right? A kid's expelled, they're out of school, they're on the corner, they're getting in trouble, so they could bring a really different perspective to the conversation than maybe what you were used to hearing. So
What did I hear? 13 days they're usually in the youth center after they've been expelled? Something like that.
Wow, I hadn't heard that stat. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Yeah.
Can I just step back to the beginning?
Yeah.
Where you started. These were zero tolerance laws. I heard you use that term. Was the state law considered a zero tolerance law?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And, all right.
So there was a host of things that the school district's hands were tied, right? They weren't as tied as sometimes they thought they were, let me just say, but but whatever. So if you had arson, if you assaulted a teacher, this could be considered, I hope that's okay that I touch, touching a teacher like that, or accidentally touching a teacher when they're breaking up a fight, that could be considered assault of a teacher, and that would be expelled. So we were seeing
Butter knives? One kid brought a butter knife to school.
So some of it, that's definitely not in the law, that's mandatory. But if you brought a knife over 3 inches, so you'd see these evidence packets where they have the ruler out and they're measuring the blade of the knife. Well, anyone who has boys of a certain age knows that they are fascinated by knives, and or they go hunting and they sometimes will bring those knives to school accidentally and sometimes on purpose. So there was a lot of these. Well, we have to expel, the schools would say. There was exceptions in the law, but whatever. So that was what was going on. So this really collaborative group, every county had a team to advocate for changes, and a lot of times mediators were a part of that. The judges were a part of it, law enforcement, community mental health, sometimes nonprofits. I think we were probably unusual in our involvement. I don't think a lot of the other teams around the state necessarily had nonprofits involved, but I feel like I'm forgetting. Oh, the schools. Yes, the schools were there, of course. And DHHS got really, Department of Health and Human Services actually was really playing a leadership role for many years, which was kind of interesting. From the truancy perspective, I think they got really interested in truancy and absences and things like that. So the law went into effect August 1st, 2017. And so
The new law.
the new laws, yes. The new laws. So I'm trying to decide where I want to start. It really ended state mandated expulsions for everything except firearms, which is federal law, the Federal Gun-Free Schools Act. There's still some exceptions that can apply. Frankly, there's not that many kids that are bringing guns to school. I've been doing advocacy for 7 years, and I can think of one case that I've had. And he denied it, but supposedly he brought a gun to school. So that's not a very common one. It may be in other areas, but just hasn't been something that I've experienced a lot. So the new laws required, I'm going to be so curious to hear your reactions to some of these things, but the new laws required that school districts must consider using restorative practices and as an alternative or in addition to suspension or expulsion under this act. And according to the law, restorative practice should be a first consideration to remediate offenses such as interpersonal conflicts, bullying, verbal and physical conflicts, theft makes total sense to me, damage to property, class disruption, harassment, and cyberbullying. Yeah.
So maybe you'll get to this eventually, but the problem is that there's no money or anything for these restorative practices. So I'm curious how that has played out.
Oh yeah, we'll talk about how it plays out, but great point. Any other reactions to that? Did you guys already all know that this was a requirement?
Yes.
This is the Jeff Irwin law, right?
I don't know if Jeff did that one or not. I mean, he definitely voted in favor, but he wasn't the sponsor, I don't think.
These 10 days.
I think Adam Zemke might have been one of the co-sponsors, yeah.
If you can comment on this 10-day suspension of 10 days or fewer where there's no rebuttal of presumption.
Yeah, we'll get to that in just a second, yeah.
I was always troubled by the use of the word consider in there. It really bothers me.
What do you want it to say?
It should say must use. Because consider, that's a pretty big wide opening.
Yeah, so there'll be a theme here that all of this is to consider versus, well, there's some places where you must consider, but it's still consider. You can consider it and be done, which we'll talk about. I don't know, I've had mixed feelings. I'm very passionate about restorative practices, but there's something really strange to me about requiring restorative. Do you know what I'm saying?
Is that ever defined?
It's defined in the law, and I think maybe I tried to include that in here, but because it has to be voluntary, right? Like, do restorative circles work when you
I was
require?
going to make that point.
Yeah.
That the parties in restorative things need to be buying into this. And
Yeah.
not always, that doesn't always happen.
So I've just always felt weird about that part of the law. I don't know if I'm allowed to admit that, but I'm very passionate about restorative practices, but it just, something about it is weird. But this is the part that kind of ends zero tolerance. So it now says school districts must consider each of the following factors before any suspension, even 1 day, or expulsion. So there's 7 factors there. So the age, but let me wait, before I tell you the 7 factors, what I'll tell you is happening is that most school districts either forget or it's a checklist. So to me, that doesn't, like the fact that, or you just write like their age is 15 doesn't mean you've considered it. And so we have our own tool that we use and we bring into these hearings where we're like, okay, well 15 means this is where they're at developmentally. So this is the implication of like what's going on, right? So we're talking more about the implications, but that's not the practice of what's going on. It's only year 3 of this law. This is the beginning of year 3. So we've come a long ways. The first year, like, no, everyone was like, what? There's 7 factors. What's that? I mean, I think there's now people are like, there's awareness that there's laws, but anyway. So the pupil's age is one of them. The disciplinary history, which in our experience has been a pretty double-edged sword. So previously in hearings, maybe relevant pieces of background would be allowed, and that's it. But now they're like, we're gonna just vomit like everything this kid has ever done. And if you are in a school that tends to write up kids frequently, then you're seeing this like huge rap sheet. So just imagine as a kid how that feels to like hear about all your worst stuff at a meeting in front of adults, and everyone's staring at you and you have so much at stake, you're about to lose your education. Like, it's not a great feeling. So I really try to pay attention to their body language in those meetings, and I usually like to let my youth speak first at hearings, but if I see them like deflating as they listen to all the terrible things about them, then I will usually say something really awesome about them first before I let them speak. And I think one of the things we do bring up in those meetings is, okay, well, they've been doing this, but what have you been doing, school, to respond? Like, what are the positive interventions? So you're just, all you've done is suspend. Like, I'm not sure why we're talking about this history. So we kind of try to flip it on its head a little bit at the meetings. The next one is about the seriousness of the violation. So I haven't seen the checklist this year that this law firm developed, but they forget to even put that in there. So a lot of school districts weren't even considering this at all in their tool provided by their attorney. But we certainly talk about it at hearings. And I think, you know, to equate a fight with bringing a gun to school, which is basically what you're doing if you expel a kid for 180 days for a fight. That's what federal law says that you do for bringing a gun to school. Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. And so we'll talk about that. Having your first fight versus and defending yourself is different than constantly initiating fights with another student, right? Like, there's degrees of seriousness, and I think, and sometimes people get hurt and sometimes they don't. We're seeing a lot of expulsions like in the Thumb and Western Michigan, where it's because kids are vaping, because adults are freaked out that kids are vaping, but help me understand like why kicking a kid out for 45 days is an answer to vaping. I don't quite understand that. So whatever. So the seriousness of the violation, they must consider that. Whether the violation committed by the student threatened the safety, and often it did, and we help them think about why and how and what they could do about it. Whether restorative practices will be used to address the violation. And y'all, I have so many funny stories, but one of my favorite was this district that often expels for fighting, and we were appealing to the board, and I was like, it was my first hearing there since the laws changed. I'm like, it's a new day. It's like the new laws are here, and we don't expel for fighting, and but on their checklist it said fighting was too serious for restorative practices. So just so you know, I was like, oh really? Because they use that for like murder trials sometimes. So like, I don't know if it's too serious, but okay. So we see that a lot. They'll write too serious for restorative practices. And then the last one, whether a lesser intervention would properly address the violation or behavior. So I'll just tell you, anything you tell me, I will, unless it's like a 1-day suspension, I will have an alternative for you. So you say 30 days, why not 10? Why not 5? So we can usually come up with a lesser intervention that we think that would work better. Someone was asking about the rebuttable presumption. So I think before the laws passed, the presumption was you must be expelled. That's how we keep our schools safe. We have to get you out. Whereas a lot of the research that's been coming out over the last 20 years is that actually districts with higher rates of discipline are actually less safe places. The climate isn't as good. There's not as much trust. Achievement is lower. And so I just can't buy that anymore, that actually makes schools safer. Now, if you just kick a kid out and you're not actually supporting them and then they come back, like, you haven't really addressed, you haven't gotten to the root of the issue, which I understand is work, however. So the rebuttable presumption is to flip that on its head, and is to say, actually, the presumption is that it is absolutely not justified to kick a kid out of school unless you've considered these 7 factors, right? And so there's no rebuttable presumption for under 10 days, which is that magic number. Those of you who maybe do special education mediation might know about that special number, but there's more due process protections for students who are being removed for over 10 days, and there's less due process protection if it's less than 10 days. I will tell you, I was in the room when this was like being negotiated, and ACLU was pushing this, their lobbyists, and one of the lobbyists for like the school administrator association or something, he's like, you're gonna lose everything for this one piece, is this worth it to you? And he's like huffing and puffing or whatever, and I was like, we're barely doing anything here. All we're saying is you have to consider 7 factors, and like, you're huffing and puffing about a rebuttable presumption. Like, it just didn't make any sense. It just shows me like where your heart really is, I guess, when it comes to these kids. Anyway, I won't get all political, but it passed. But I think that was one of the compromises, is that it would only be for 10 days or more.
Was a 10-day threshold an arbitrary thing, or is there something experience?
Yeah, that comes out of a Supreme Court decision, Goss versus Lopez. which I probably am not lawyerly enough to do a good job explaining to you, but it sets some kind of minimum due process standards.
Is there any history showing the impact academically on the student's experience if they've been expelled for 10 days as opposed to 60 days?
I don't know if I've seen research that parses it out quite like
How do they catch up, I guess?
quite like that. Yeah, but I mean, I think there's a lot of there's research that even like a 1-day suspension in 9th grade like dramatically increases your chances of dropping out.
Maybe 10 days isn't considered too much of a hazard because you might have the flu for that long.
Sure. Yeah, it's less, it's less, there's less that you have to recover from. So, but when you start to get to, I've had students get kicked out for 30 days and they were able to recover, but I think much more than that, it starts to get pretty challenging. Yeah, I mean, to me, 30 days is too much too, because that's 5, 10, 15, 20, that's 20 days is a month, right? Yeah.
I'm just wondering, that would explain then why Michigan has the highest, or is one of the states that has the highest number of youth in jail, incarcerated. I
sure.
heard that when Brian Stevenson gave his lecture, yeah.
Oh.
I mean, it's based on numbers.
I
And I
also,
was wondering why? That's fine.
but don't you think it's deeper than that, right? Like, I think that there's like, how do we view youth, and like, how do we, to me, I was just talking about this on Saturday with a group of folks, like, I think as an adult, we have like a super high responsibility and obligation to like teach students when they make a mistake and to like care for them, right? And so, but I feel like we have all sorts of policies and practices that lead to the school to prison pipeline, but that are just about, you don't belong here, so we're gonna do whatever we can to push you out and kick you out and not take the time. And it's also because we underinvest in schools in Michigan, so that's like a campaign that we're a part of as well. But anyway, so
Isn't it? It's painfully obvious that expulsion is easy,
yeah,
right? I mean, this is what, when we did this stuff up in Minnesota, that's what we're always overcoming. It's the easiest thing to do is out of sight, out of, let's get them out of here.
yeah.
And where we get them out of too is not our concern.
Do we have any economists in the room? I'm not either, but I was required to take some economy classes. But listen, like, we have this system set up in Michigan where they're really making logical choices. So you have a classroom that's crowded, you have a kid who's bugging you, you don't have enough resources. So after count day, you can kick them out, and there's no financial penalty unless they're still kicked out the next count day. So
Keep them for a month and a half. And you can,
and so the virtual schools are a cash cow. You get the same amount of money for a student in a virtual school as you do for a kid in a traditional high school. How does that make any sense? You have 2 teachers for like 100 kids that all they have to do is text their teacher once a week, and that's 100% attendance, and that's the same amount of money as, like, it doesn't even make any sense. And I feel like you probably think I'm lying right now, and I wish I was lying, because it doesn't make any sense, some of this stuff. But anyway, I did.
didn't even know there are virtual schools.
Yeah, there's lots of virtual schools. So that's the new, like, that's the new fancy expulsion. Like, that's our new pushed out thing that we were having to, like, figure out how to challenge. And so we're working with a couple folks to collect stories, because we think storytelling is a start, as a way to try to combat this.
So
Because
that's very different from WAVE, which keeps track of kids.
yeah. I mean, I don't think all virtual schools are bad, or like having some virtual education isn't, I wouldn't want to do it. I don't learn that way. But I think WAVE, yeah, you can go, and they're doing more and more face-to-face stuff. We have a really great partnership with WAVE, and you're required to go there at least twice a week, and they have lots of staff there. But still, even that, I think a lot of students, that's not going to be where they thrive either, right?
Are they privately run?
Some of them are. Some of them are privately run charter
So you get a
schools.
profit motive involved.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's a cash cow. What's that? WAVE is an alternative school. It's a consortium school, so Washtenaw County School Districts buy slots in it, and it's governed by a consortium board. But you would go, and you have to go at least twice a week. You can go more than that, and a lot of students do. And you can, and it's self-paced. The curriculum is online, although they're doing more creative things like literacy circles and things like that to help students gain credits.
But I remember a kid who was just terrified of school, just couldn't stand school, so they'd meet in a coffee shop. He'd meet with his teachers at Wave, and so they do.
The
adjust
staff
to
there
the
is
inter-
amazing, yeah. But, and I think it's one thing, like, if you are a kid who's got severe anxiety or you have whatever's going on and you're choosing to go there, that's different to me than like what's really going on when we have school districts, some more than others. I mean, Ann Arbor hardly sends anyone there that they don't want to deal with you anymore, and so they're pushing their problem to this because then they don't, whatever. There's a lot of that kind of stuff going on in our county. So the backside tells you some of the definition of restorative practices. So they have examples of what might come out of a restorative practice meeting, right? You might apologize, you might participate in community service, counseling, pay restitution. I mean, that's in the law, but I've never seen that required, or I think that would be kind of bizarro, at least for the families we're working with. So I think the emphasis is that it needs to be voluntary. And so that's what we see, is that either we can't convince our own students that they want to do it, although most of the time I can after a few meetings, but even if my student wants to do it, then the school will say, well, the other student said no way, there's no way, their parents say there's no way. So then I'll try to say, well, what if we did a restorative circle with the teachers that were involved? Can we start there if that student really doesn't want to do it? But that's been the challenge, I think, in the implementation. I think the intent was good. I know some of the legislators who advocated for that to be in the law, and I know their intent was good and they're passionate about restorative practices, but in practice, it's been challenging. So I want to share a couple stories with you. Any questions about the law before I talk a little bit more about? So I think what's happened is that you have a lot of schools who were frankly forced to get trained, staff who felt forced to get trained in restorative practices, and there's a lot of turnover in schools that happen to need to do that have more discipline issues. They tend to be districts that are more under-resourced, and there is a lot more turnover in staff. So I know that that's been a big problem in IPSI schools, is like they spend the time to train staff in restorative, and then I mean, I wish I had this stat, but it's unreal the amount of turnover they have, because you can go over to Ann Arbor schools and make substantially more money. And so I think it's just been a challenge. But one story I have for you is a student who I've known probably since he was in elementary school, and he's now an adult through some of my other work doing education advocacy. But this is a kid who'd had a really hard history with schools. So one time he'd been homeless a lot, and not a lot of structure or support at home. And he, one year he was expelled for 180 days the first day of school because he said like F you to the principal. I wish that was like not a true story, but this was several years ago before the new laws have changed, but it just like blew my mind, and like I found out about it after it had already happened. So he had missed a lot of school, either because he skipped or because he was expelled or because he was suspended. So we had gotten him enrolled. This was middle school at this time, and finally gotten him evaluated for an IEP. And so sometimes kids who are in foster care or homeless or really transient, like the disability gets kind of hidden. Well, it's just because they're missing a lot of school. Well, I went through, combed through his history. I'm like, it's a lot more. I actually think he has fetal alcohol syndrome. I don't know if he'll ever get that diagnosed, but he was borderline cognitively impaired. Definitely had emotional impairments, like a lot of anxiety. It's just like a lot going on for this kid. Probably one of my hardest cases in my career. So I think he kept going to school, and he'd have his hoodie up. That's how he felt safe. He was almost like nonverbal in school. And I was like, can't you just like let him, like can he get to a point where he'll feel safe enough to take off the hoodie? Why do we have to care so much about that kind of stuff? So part of this like school to prison pipeline is also about just being arbitrary about rules that I understand where they're coming from, and I also understand a lot of adults have a lot of control issues, and it's hard for them to give kids choices and to not to let little things go that don't really matter. And we all have different thresholds for that, and I know that school staff are very stressed, but they couldn't let that go. So he would get in some kind of, verbal stuff with them, not physical. And sometimes he would just storm out. So something like that had happened. That kind of an incident had happened, and he wasn't allowed to come back to school until he had a meeting. And I said, so actually you can't he's homeless, so you can't require there be a meeting. It's like extremely difficult for this parent to be able to get to your school. And I'm like, but I can take him to this meeting. And so we did. And I was told it was going to be a restorative circle. So I was all excited to see how this school, who has a history of extremely harsh discipline, chaos, burned out staff, burned out administrators, a rotating cast of administrators, and nothing's changed years later at this particular school, unfortunately. It breaks my heart. Anyway, so I go, I'm like, really, I can't wait to see, right? I love restorative practices. This is going to be great. And so does anyone want to predict what happened at this meeting? It was a disaster, because instead of being a restorative circle, it was an administrator yelling at him, pointing her finger, and telling him all the things he did wrong, and then said, you need to apologize. And I was like, what's just happened? And I'm thinking, I didn't even know what to say. Honestly, I was so stunned at what had just happened. And he actually did apologize, which is a huge feat. I don't think he meant it. I don't think he was genuine, right? But he gave his first apology, and he was allowed to go to school. But I tell you that story because I think, unfortunately, that's the kind of thing that started happening so much in this district, and so that it almost gave restorative practices a bad name. And Belinda and I were actually just recently talking about the school, and I was like, they're trying, but it's this hard. I think it's actually better this year, but she said something profound to me, which is schools need to be ready. There needs to be a readiness, because the adults have to be ready to be vulnerable. Adults need to be willing to admit that sometimes they made a mistake. And if the adults aren't ready, restorative isn't gonna matter or be meaningful. So I think it's a complicated thing to implement in schools, unless there's really there's been some time put in to get that readiness there, to get buy-in from the schools. So I do believe in it still, but I think that's the kind of thing that I'm concerned about, I guess. I wanted to share just one other story. This is very recent. That one was several years ago. This is a recent one that one of my staff shared with me, just to give you another sense. It was a 10th grade student, and she was expelled from her local district. This is in Wayne County. The dean of culture told the student and the parent that the student couldn't come back to school due to his poor attendance. And the dean threatened the parent's immigration status, and he threatened truancy court. So expulsion of the student was allowed to return to school somehow, and a restorative circle was held with this dean of student. And an internal staff member who was trained in restorative circles led the circle. It was at the conference table, and the student was not comfortable and felt attacked again by the dean, and the dean was taking notes and texting on his phone throughout the whole circle. So eventually they came to an agreement, but it's I'm sure you guys as trained mediators are this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, right? So it's this challenge of, I think we probably need to be doing more to bring our trained mediators into these situations to support the schools, because when they do it wrong, it can be really damaging. But the student I'm going to go see after we meet today, who's over at the youth center, we were talking about restorative circles recently. But anyway, when I met with him last week, we were kind of reflecting on, I'm like, well, what would that have looked like for you if you could have walked in to a circle where everyone's just around a circle and we're talking about how you could repair the harm for this person. I'm not going to get into the crime that he committed, but the victim was there, and it was what if that's how it would have been? You weren't going into a courtroom with being sure you're going to get arrested, but you were going to sit down, hear how it impacted he's like, yeah, I could have done that. He's like, I know about restorative circles. I'm like, you do? Tell me about that. And the same middle school that I was saying, we've had so many problems, he actually was like, oh, we used to do restorative all the time there. And it really kept me out of trouble. It kept me from getting suspended. So it was just I was like, okay. So maybe there's these baby steps, it's not being done. It's certainly not being done perfectly, but I don't know if restorative circles ever are done perfectly, and so there is power. So I don't know, should we say it's required? I still have a lot of mixed feelings about it. I believe so much in it but you can't force people. So I'm just saying, there's like a lot of, we have to live in the gray sometimes, right, in the complexity, but it was just really powerful for me to hear from him that like he learned this in his school, he saw that it was happening in his school, and he could see how that could make a difference in his life, yeah.
Is he in detention for a drug thing?
No.
So he would have come through the regular juvenile court,
Yeah.
not through drug court.
Yeah, he has been through drug court before, I believe, but
My experience has been that restorative justice is just a check, something to be checked off.
right.
We did it.
right.
And many of us know, it's hard work.
Yeah.
And not only do you need to be trained, but it takes time.
Yeah.
And the time factor is the thing that people just don't want to slow down, like the superintendent couldn't get off his phone.
Yeah.
You almost need a coach in the
Yeah.
room to say, just a minute, time out.
We can't have this or that.
You're getting away from restorative justice practices, and going back to your old style.
Yeah. So yeah, I've been, ever since Boland and I had that conversation, I've been thinking more about how can we help school districts be more ready? How can we help adults be ready to be vulnerable and to give students a chance? And so one of the things that I've stopped advocating that you start with like the formal circle in response to an offense. And what I always say to districts is, first of all, you need to have conversations about what your values are as a school in terms of discipline, and you need to bring in community members and teachers and whatever. But if you're going to start anywhere with restorative practice, start with community building circles. Like, that's a powerful place to start. I remember Pathways started doing that a few years ago, and the kids were like advocating. They're like, we need our Monday morning or Friday afternoon circle so we can feel ready to go into the weekend, or we feel ready to come back. And so that's a powerful way just to show, right, that it works. Or I think about DRC's project at Skyline and how students have really shown the way. Students get this way quicker sometimes than adults in power, unfortunately. Yes.
I'm just sitting in here and listening to you and the story that you said about, the experience you had with the Restorative Circle that was in school. I'm part of the school as a part of the staff myself, and I'm just thinking that really the solution is to just hire a couple of these NBC trainers to just come and really teach, the staff in school,
Yeah.
the principals, the teacher consultant, the teachers involved, also the people that are involved in the circle.
Yeah.
To talk about how nonviolent and how to really have the experience of being heard
Yeah.
and being empathized.
Yeah.
Rather than the kid just saying, or apologize,
Right, exactly.
Or pointing finger right at the circle. Just
Yeah.
in the circle.
I think the schools where I see it working the best, there's a champion that's really dedicated to being there is one thing, and but then you also have leadership who's open to it, right? So I think both of those things are important.
Well, and it strikes me that the pace of circles, certainly, but other restorative justice practices is so antithetical to the pace of a school.
Yeah, I think you're so right.
I mean, it is, I'm blown away sometimes when I'm in the school setting, especially when I have done a circle, co-facilitated a circle at a high school with staff. And it was at the end of the day, way at the end of the day. And the pace was just so different from what they're used to
Yeah.
running in a day.
Yeah.
They were a little blown away by actually how it can work. Kathy was my co-circle keeper. And I just think that's part of the problem, especially when you get the managers, the administrators, all the manager types. The idea of spending 2 hours in this circle is just,
Yeah, I think you're right.
Well, how often here do you do them off of school property?
We don't do circles, but and so I'd say, but
yeah.
I don't know if people have thoughts about that. I know that's a lot of this. It seems like a lot of the special education circles have happened around here versus the school. Not just the mediations, but I'm not sure about that. I think they often happen in the school, which can be challenging, right?
What's your experience?
Are they usually done in the school?
Well, we did this was a staff.
Yeah.
This didn't involve students.
Oh, interesting.
But it was 2 hours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think they usually are. So I think just in terms of our journey as an agency, we have started more advocating for community building circles, proactively having those values conversations. But I think we also started thinking about if we're going to be advocating for restorative and using it, like we really need to be analyzing everything that we're doing. So we started having our staff meetings in circles, which took a little getting used to for people. They're like, I need my table. I'm like, nope, no tables. You have to be present. I mean, we go back and forth between tables and whatever, but I think we've been doing it enough now that people are used to it. But it really was amazing because people became engaged in a different way. I think we started handling staff conflicts that way. We've had some our staff has grown a lot over the last couple of years, and so naturally there's new people are coming in, and so there's been things that have said that have hurt other people's feelings, and so we've dealt with that. And then they often, wow, that was a long, that was like a 3-hour, that took a lot out of me or whatever. But we've also heard, I'm so glad that I've been given the space to share and to hear from other people. So it's been really a powerful tool to deal with conflict or challenges or anything, just as a staff. I think of a student of ours, a client of ours, I think that there's nonprofits that you break rules and that's it. You're not allowed to go there anymore, or you're not going to be part of our services, and that's certainly, we could never be that way, but we were pretty sure that one of our students stole money from one of our staff, and if not him, his friend. He never actually admitted it, but it was a powerful moment for him to hear the impact for the staff person, and so it was more like a problem-solving circle. It wasn't formal because no one was admitting that it happened, but we were pretty sure it was him, and his mom was there, and I think for him to see we're not just going to brush you away or stop working with you, but that we're going to bring you in closer, and we are going to hold you accountable. And so it was actually a really powerful circle. It was kind of an interesting, we've had to get creative in these because they're not always so someone did wrong, I've admitted it, I'm going to repair the harm. It can be more complicated. So those are some of the ways we've used it, and I wonder, we have a few minutes left if there's other questions people have. Yeah.
So it strikes me that teachers, like a lot of different professions, respect other teachers, because they know their experience. And so I think that's just a little experience I have. It's hard for when outside people come in, mediators, whoever, who are not teachers, to try and help them understand restorative practices. So it would seem to me, if money could be made available, which I understand there is no money, which is really not helpful, to train teachers who could then train other teachers.
Yeah.
If we could do something like that, it might create more of a movement.
We're part of a national group called the Dignity in Schools campaign, and one of our first conferences there was a group they represented a teachers union, but they had really jumped on the restorative wagon or whatever, and they were saying some of the same things I'm just saying, we're starting to use it in our staff meetings, but they became really the advocates for restorative. And I just think of how many teachers I talk to who say, well, we don't know how to deal with classroom management, and so if that was part of their instruction, then they would have another, a really powerful tool in their toolkit just to deal with the little conflicts in your class that sometimes get bigger, that you can deal with things in your own class. I think that would be really powerful. Yeah.
I know one school system that trained all their teachers in August, but then when school started a month later, they went back to the way they'd always done things. It was
that ongoing support is so important.
Yeah, you need that ongoing support and that kind of.
Because who doesn't? Don't we all? And especially when you're stressed.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's hard to change your behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I was touched about your story about the young man who was scared to go into the courtroom situation. And I was just thinking of people in the community that would like to help.
Yeah.
And the men in the community, older people, retired people that could be there for these people, young people.
Yeah.
And you mentioned community building circles. Are you bringing in community people to act as support, for these kind of situations? Is there something going on like that where people who do want to help, just support, be there,
Yeah.
can be trained or, brought together to
Yeah,
volunteer for those kind of situations?
I'm pretty sure that at least IPSI's had volunteers that have come into the restorative rooms. For us, we use volunteers to do tutoring for students, but they have to make a long-term commitment. So we're pretty protective of our youth. They've had a lot of people in and out of their lives, especially our foster youth. So we're pretty careful about the use of volunteers. But that's how we've use volunteers is for that tutoring if they're in a virtual program or they're not in school at all, how to help them gain some credits and really start to build trust with someone. Trust is a big issue with the population I work with. I'm sure that's not the case for all behavior issues, but they really don't trust systems, they don't trust strangers. So that's an issue. But yeah, that's a great idea. And I think
Some church groups that might, have groups that would.
I was
like
thinking
to
of
do
My
something
Brother's
like
Keeper too, which is
Yeah.
a program that's really.
Yeah, they're doing
taking off.
volunteer. Yeah, it's once a month on a Saturday. They're meeting. Yeah, that's a great example.
I was just wondering, not church and all that is important, but I feel like council members, city councils should know about what you're telling us. And I know some of them are not even aware or interested. But schools are such an important thing in a community.
Yeah.
And that should be like top on their list.
Yeah.
And if we think about, if all they think about is money for the city, tell them it affects real estate too.
Yeah.
The house is as good as the schools around it.
Yeah.
And
There's
things
definitely.
like that. People don't.
I think there's some city council people that maybe would be aware of some of the work that
Yeah, some are, some
we're
are
doing.
not.
Right. Of course.
And-
Of course.
and even talking to people my age sometimes, they say, well, they vote, like when we go to vote to increase the millage, they say, well, I'm done with that. Wait a minute, how can you be done with that? We're never done with that.
Yeah.
Just one last thought I had, it precedes most of you people being around, but in the very early 70s in Ann Arbor, the school system was challenged by some school parents, specifically along Green Road housing project, because the teachers were not qualified to understand black English.
Yes.
And this was a challenge that was thrown out to the education system to recognize that not everybody's vanilla. There are different flavors, and the communication skills vary amongst teachers and students and parents and students because of a language difference is common or unique as black English.
That was the one lawsuit that I guess Student Advocacy Center was a part of in our history.
It was a long time ago, right?
It was a long time ago. Yeah, I think
1972.
we were just reflecting on it because if you go to our website, which is www.studentadvocacycenter.org, Ruth's grandson did a documentary about her, but there's a whole little section on the Black English case and her part in that. So, yeah, right. Yep, it was Ann Arbor schools and that school. So.
Well, thank you so much. I think we all have learned a lot.